Hey there, and welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we're going deep on something that's pretty fundamental to philosophy. Properties. You sent us an excerpt from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy all about properties. And let me tell you, it gets pretty dense. But luckily, we've got our expert here to break it all down for us.
Always happy to dive into the dense stuff. Properties really are at the heart of so many philosophical debates. I mean, even a simple question like, what is redness, can really send you down a rabbit hole.
Yeah, for sure. So before we fall too deep into that rabbit hole, let's start with the basics. The Stanford Encyclopedia, it defines properties as those entities that can be predicated of things, or they say, in other words, attributed to them. So what does that actually mean for someone who maybe isn't, super familiar with all the philosophical jargon?
Hmm. Well, think of it this way. When we say something like Socrates is wise, we're basically attributing the property of wisdom to Socrates. So properties are what we can say about things, like the qualities or characteristics we ascribe to them.
Okay, so wisdom is something Socrates has, but it's not like, a physical object he's carrying around or something. And this is what I always find interesting. Like, this same property, it can be shared. Plato can also be wise, right?
Absolutely. Properties aren't limited to just one individual. They can be shared by many different things. And this actually leads us to a classic philosophical problem. It's called the one over many problem.
Right, the one over many. How can a single property, like wisdom, be present in all these different people? Almost like kind of mystical, isn't it?
It really is. And that's why philosophers have been kind of wrestling with this idea for centuries, Are properties like these mind-independent entities? Like, are they out there in the world like Plato thought? Or are they just mental constructs, like something we use to organize our experience? This is the whole debate about universals.
Yeah, universals. That's the big picture here. So we've got these properties, and they help us group things together. They're central to this whole idea of universals. Why are they so important to philosophy? Why should a philosopher care about all this? It seems pretty abstract.
Well, think about it. To understand properties is basically to understand how we even categorize and make sense of the world. How do we know that, like, this apple and that apple are both apples? Well, it's because they share certain properties in common. Properties are like the foundation of our concepts and our ability to form judgments about the world.
So they're not just, some airy philosophical thing. They're fundamental to how we understand reality itself.
Right. And they also bring up these really deep questions about the relationship between language and reality. The Stanford Encyclopedia talks about the difference between predicates, like the actual words we use to talk about properties, and the properties themselves. So is wise is a linguistic term as a predicate, but wisdom, that's the property it refers to.
So it's like the old saying, the map isn't the territory. The words are just like tools for pointing to these deeper concepts.
Exactly. And it can get tricky because the encyclopedia says that properties can be both the subject and the object of predication. So we can say Socrates is wise, but we can also say wisdom is a virtue.
Wait, hold on. How can a property, something that describes things, also be described itself? Isn't that like circular?
That's what makes it so interesting. It kind of suggests that properties exist on different levels. So wisdom, that might be a first order property of Socrates, a characteristic he possesses. But being a virtue, that'd be like a second order property, a characteristic of wisdom itself.
Okay, my brain's starting to hurt a little. So properties are complex. They can even describe other properties. But how do they actually relate to the things they're describing? The encyclopedia mentions this idea of exemplification. What is that?
Exemplification, it describes the relationship between a particular thing and the property it instantiates. So when we say like Socrates exemplifies wisdom, we're talking about the specific way that wisdom is actually manifested in Socrates.
Okay, I think I get that. But here's where I get tripped up. If exemplification is a relationship, doesn't that just create a whole new problem? I mean, what's relating that relationship to the things it's connecting? It's like we need another relationship to explain the first one, and then another and another forever.
You've just stumbled upon a classic philosophical dilemma. It's called Bradley's redress. This idea that if every relationship needs another relationship to ground it, then we end up in the infinite loop.
So even the way properties connect to the things they describe, it's a philosophical minefield. I think we need a minute to process all this before we go any further.
Yeah, let's take a breather. We'll pick this back up in part 2. Welcome back. I hope everyone's had some time to digest all that talk about, exemplification and Bradley's redress.
Yeah, my head's still spinning a bit, but I'm ready to jump back into the world of properties. So we talked about how properties relate to the things they describe. But what about the relationships between properties? Like, how do we know when two properties are actually the same? The Stanford Encyclopedia, it threw out some really dense terminology, like extension and intension, and even something called hyperintension. What is all that about?
Oh yeah, that's a whole other layer of complexity. The whole question of property identity, it's really thorny. Do we look at their extension, like all the things those properties apply to in the world? So for example, if being a rational animal and being human, if they apply to all the same beings, are they the same property?
Hmm. Well, if they both describe all the same things, they must be the same property, right?
Well, not necessarily. What about properties that, they have the same extension but different meanings? Like, let's say being a creature with a heart and being a creature with a kidney. I mean, in our world, every creature with a heart also has a kidney, and vice versa.
Yeah, but those are definitely different properties. Having a heart versus having a kidney, those are totally different ideas, even if they happen to, apply to all the same things.
Exactly. And that's where this idea of intention comes in, like the deeper meaning or the concept behind the property. So even if two properties have the same extension, if their intentions are different, then we could consider them to be distinct.
Okay, so extension versus intensions. Like, we need a whole philosophical dictionary to follow along here. But the Stanford Encyclopedia, it also mentions something even weirder. Hyperintention. What is that?
Okay, yeah. Hyperintension gets at even finer grain distinctions. Like, imagine you have two properties and they have the same extension and the same intention, but they still differ in some, subtle logical way. Some philosophers would say that those tiny differences are enough to make the properties distinct.
Okay, my head is officially spinning now. So are we saying there are like endless ways to slice and dice properties? How can we even begin to understand this?
Well, this leads to two main perspectives, really. You have the sparse conception and the abundant conception of properties. The sparse view, sometimes it's called minimalism, it basically says there's a limited number of properties and they're grounded in the physical world confirmed by science. So things like, mass, charge, spin.
So it's like the bare minimum, the no-frills approach. Only the properties we absolutely need to explain the world.
Right. No room for vague notions or properties that don't actually have concrete instances in the world. But that leads to the question, what about concepts like, beauty or justice or even consciousness? Are those all illusions if they can't be reduced down to some fundamental physical property?
Yeah, I was just thinking that. It feels like minimalism leaves out a lot of what makes us human. All the stuff we care about in philosophy.
Yeah, it's a common criticism, and that's where the abundant conception comes in. This is sometimes called maximalism. And this view says that basically, if you can think of a predicate, there's a property for it. So it's a world overflowing with properties, even ones that might seem, weird or paradoxical.
So even something like being round and square, that would have its own property, even though it's like impossible.
Yeah, exactly. For maximalists, properties, they're not constrained by the physical world. They exist in this kind of abstract realm of concepts, whether or not they have instances in reality.
So they're really going all in on properties, huh? But doesn't that make the world incredibly complicated? Like, how do we even deal with a property that can actually exist?
It's a fair point. I mean, maximalism might be great for explaining, our language and our imagination and all that, but it does kind of clash with our intuitions about, the physical world, what science tells us.
Okay, so we've got these two extremes, sparse and abundant. Is there any middle ground? Some way to, acknowledge the complexity without going overboard with all these properties?
Well, there are some philosophers who propose this idea of dualism of properties, so they're suggesting that there are actually two distinct realms of properties.
Two realms. So now we have even more properties to deal with.
Okay, hear me out. This view basically says that you have these sparse essential properties, the ones grounded in the physical world, but then you also have these abundant conceptual properties that kind of live in the realm of, thought and language. The Stanford Encyclopedia talked about Beeler's account, where you have these qualities, which are those sparse properties, and then concepts, which are the abundant ones.
Okay, I'm starting to see how this could work. So we have like the basic building blocks of reality, those sparse properties, and then this whole other layer of concepts that, explain our inner lives and our language and all of that.
Exactly. It's trying to make room for both, the objective features of the world and the subjective realm of the mind. Recognize that different types of properties might have different purposes.
So it's like a philosophical compromise. We can have our science and our humanities too.
Right. It's a way to say that, yeah, properties are more diverse and multifaceted than we might initially think.
This is all so mind-blowing. It's like we've traveled the whole universe of properties, from the sparse to the abundant and everything in between.
And we're not even done. There's still more to uncover, like the whole world of complex properties.
Complex properties. Is this property adventure ever going to end?
Let's take a break here and let all this sink in, then we'll come back and wrap things up with a look at, some of those more intricate aspects of properties.
Okay, so we're back for the final part of our properties journey, and we've covered a lot, from sparse properties to abundant properties and even property identity. But before we wrap up, there are a couple more things about properties I want to explore.
Yeah, we still have some ground to cover. Last time we mentioned complex properties, and those are definitely worth talking about more.
Yeah, for sure. So we've talked about simple properties, like those building blocks, but what makes a property complex?
Well, complex properties, they're built from simpler ones, through different combinations. Think of like the property being red and round. It's basically combining being red and being round using that logical operator and.
Okay, that makes sense. Like if you've got properties for red and round, then it seems obvious that you'd also have red and round. Is it really that straightforward, though?
Well, not every philosopher agrees. Minimalists, they might say that those combinations are just redundant. Like being red and round is already explained by just being red and being round. You don't need to add like extra stuff.
Right, but wouldn't that make it hard to explain, how we understand complex concepts? Like, we use those kinds of combinations all the time, right? In our language and our thoughts.
That's true. And that's where those abundant properties have an advantage. They can handle all sorts of complex combinations, reflecting how rich our conceptual framework is.
So it's like another point for maximalism. It seems like it captures the way we actually think about things better.
I think so. And then there are these things called structural properties. They take complexity to a whole other level.
Structural properties. The Stanford Encyclopedia mentioned those, but I'm still a bit confused about what they are.
Okay, so imagine like the property being a water molecule, H2O. It's not just about having two hydrogen atoms and an oxygen atom. It's about how they're bonded together, like the specific three-dimensional structure, the way those parts are arranged, the relations between them that's like essential to the property itself.
So it's like the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. It's not just the ingredients, but also how they're put together.
Exactly. And these structural properties are everywhere in science, from molecules and organisms to like social systems and galaxies. They help us see how these complex systems emerge from simpler components.
It's kind of like the concept of emergence, like we talk about in philosophy of science, how new properties kind of arise from the way simpler elements are organized.
Right. And speaking of philosophy of science, the Stanford Encyclopedia also talks about how formal logic can help us understand properties.
Formal logic, I thought we were done with logic after, Bradley's redress. But really, though, how does formal logic fit into this?
Well, formal logic gives us these really powerful tools to analyze properties. We can develop systems that have all these, special symbols and rules that let us represent properties and then explore like the logical relationships between them.
So we're not just talking about using logic to argue about properties, but like using logic to actually represent the properties themselves.
Exactly. It's like imagine you have this system where you have terms for properties, even variables that stand for them. Just like in normal logic, we use variables for individuals. This lets us make really precise statements about properties, about how they relate to each other, and then we can like derive conclusions using logical deduction.
The encyclopedia mentions something about type theory and type-free theories. What's the difference? Why does it matter?
Okay, so type theory, it tries to avoid paradoxes by organizing properties into this hierarchy. Like different types, it's like put them in separate boxes so they can't interact in ways that create problems. But it can feel kind of limiting and it makes it harder to talk about, properties having properties, which we know is important.
Yeah, so it sounds like type-free theories are more flexible. They better reflect how we normally think about properties.
I'd agree with that. In type-free theories, properties can apply to themselves without causing contradictions. It's a much more natural way to think about properties, but you have to be really careful with the logic so you don't end up with those paradoxes.
This is all so interesting, but it's a lot to take in. Formal logic lets us think about properties in a totally different way.
It really does, and it has some really interesting implications for other areas of philosophy, too.
Oh, yeah. Like what?
Well, for one thing, formal property theories can tell us a lot about how language works. By representing properties in this formal system, we can actually capture like the logical structure of sentences, and that gives us a deeper understanding of what those sentences mean.
So it's connected to semantics, the study of meaning.
Yes, exactly. And properties are also really important in the foundations of math. Like, instead of talking about three apples, we can talk about the property of being a collection of three things. Numbers themselves can be seen as properties.
Wow, so properties aren't just these abstract ideas. They have real-world implications for how we understand language and logic and even math. It's like they're built into like the very foundation of how we understand everything.
Exactly. Properties are fundamental to, how we make sense of the world, how we categorize things, how we build up knowledge.
Well, I think that's about all the time we have for today. It feels like I've learned more about properties than I ever thought possible.
It's been great exploring all of this with you.
And for you, our listener, one last thing to think about. If properties can have properties, does that mean that properties are like a kind of thing themselves? And if so, what kind of thing are they? That's something for you to ponder. Until next time on The Deep Dive.